equity means that people's life outcomes are not predetermined by their race, and that people have access to resources not only to survive, but to thrive. And that folks can exist simply as they are, regardless of their identity, without having to worry about legislation specifically targeting their ability to make choices and strip them of their agency.
So for me, racial equality, so for me to understand that, I had to also understand the basis behind race and how it's in our institutions, in our culture, and how it's used also as a basis to discriminate, and how there is a hierarchy, right? A lot of times we don't recognize that there's a hierarchy of race, and it's very much white versus non-white. And that then guided me to understand that racial equality is not just about the absence of discrimination or racism in our society, but also intentional systems and institutions that have to be in place, that have to be sustainable, that have to be grassroots, led by the people on the ground, in order for them to be a society where everyone can thrive, right? So they have to be intentional systems that don't only, eradicate discrimination and racism, but that sustain other systems that allow us to achieve, that allow us to decolonize our mindsets for us to really be able to get to the root of the issue.
I would agree with the other two panelists. So when Monty talks about making sure that we're replacing the systems that exist, it's not like getting rid of the police and then establishing like community policing. It's what's in place of the things that are historically and systemically in place in order to harm marginalized and systemically marginalized communities, so making sure that we're leaning into restorative justice, making sure that we're leaning into transformative justice, making sure that we're not trying to like DEI or workshop our way out of a lot of, and making sure like y'all really need to get rid of the book clubs and the workshops. Like it's real cute, but the people probably don't need not another check, like how many conversations do you have to have before you would action to something? Because the time for reparations is now. Amen. It got real quiet when I said that, and that's okay. That's my particular form of racial justice. I passed the conversations, I show up to conversations as a formality and as a nicety as part of my community obligations, but I'm very clear that racial justice for me and the historically, systemically, violently oppressed communities that I'm part of is reparations. So if there's not a check attached, we can have a cute little conversation, but you need to put something tangible with it, because right now my people are dying in the streets and in the jails and in the prisons. And Joe Hogshead has moved forward with a $500 million jail that's sitting real cute on the outskirts of the city, and our homelessness rate is astronomical. The eviction rate in Indiana is incredibly high. So racial justice for me is more about the reallocation of wealth that was established based on chattel slavery. Amen.
One of the focus areas for IPS schools is to create a community where student outcomes cannot be predicted by race or ethnicity. How is your team working with community partners to eliminate racial disproportionality and disparity, and how does your role help prepare IPS employees to meet the needs of students around racial equity?
Yeah, so one of the things we realized as a school district was that regardless of what tests were being given to our students, we could predict that our students of color, specifically our Black and our brown students, were performing at the bottom when it came to academic achievement. So we realized that something was happening in our classrooms and we needed to interrogate that. So we started to have our staff members, our teachers, and our central services folks go through this 2-day intensive racial equity training where they learn the foundational elements of systemic and institutionalized racism, and it challenges them to see racism as more than just an interpersonal interaction between two folks, and analyze it through the lens of it's woven into our institutions. It's showing up in our school district, it's showing up in your classrooms, and it's harming children. So we have this same training available to community partners. Next school year we'll be piloting like an abbreviated version for like 3 hours for different stakeholders, where folks can start making connections of racial disparities across systems. So not just like education, but in our healthcare system, in our justice system. Other ways that we are pushing our community stakeholders to join us in this movement is through coalition building. So we've been brainstorming with CICF and we're working on a road tour where we're taking this information across the city and we're starting this conversation with the folks who hold power in the city. In regards to my role specifically, I get to design opportunities for folks to continue in their journey for racial equity within the district. So some examples of that, we just wrapped up a community accountability fellowship pilot, and we took a small group of IPS staff members and spent 6 months learning about community accountability and transformative justice. And right now we're interrogating what ways can we shift our culture within the district to reduce harm, not only for students, but for everyone that walks through that building. We just launched a partnership with UVA called CT3, where we have real-time teacher coaching, and they are looking for equitable practices in classrooms, and if something is not happening, they can correct it in that moment. So in order for our teachers and everybody who is a steward to our students and our families, you have to change your mindset of how you are approaching this work, because we are the largest school district in the state. We serve predominantly Black and brown students, so it would be a disservice to all of them if we're not doing this work with intention.
Way before even the COVID-19 pandemic, 2011, Indiana passed a lot of anti-immigration laws, one specifically banning undocumented residents from receiving in-state tuition. So banning them from an equitable education. And we're still seeing the harm that is being done. It still has not been undone. Legislation has been introduced in the General Assembly, but because of really spineless politicians that do not support our community, these legislations and these bills are then dropped. So in order for us to understand that we all deserve dignity and respect, we need to understand that these are narratives that are used to divide and conquer our community. So everyone deserves just respect and dignity, especially immigrants, as we are the backbone of this country.
So anytime Black Lives Matter, we are historically and presently an abolitionist organization, so we don't believe in any of these systems. The prisons, the jails, one, because people are making a profit off of criminalizing and incarcerating largely Black and brown folks. Two, we believe in a restorative and transformative justice praxis where instead of calling out and punishing people for things that they did, that we establish community and resources for and with those people to get to the root of the problem. We're seeing a lot of intracommunal violence right now. Kids are being shot and killed in parks. A friend of an Indy 10 Black Lives Matter organizer was shot and killed in a parking lot. They had to hold them while they died. So we're seeing a lot of intracommunal violence, and instead of our minds going to let's rush them through the system and book them, it's how do we get to this point? So for us, when we say defund the police, defund is the vehicle that is going to drive the abolition of police for us. Everybody doesn't agree with that, and that's fine. But we let people know up front, like when we say defund, we don't mean take away 1% of IMPD's $261 million budget, hire a couple of, white straight social workers and throw them inside of the prison industrial complex to further target and tokenize Black and brown bodies within that system. We mean that their budget needs to be cut, slashed, year after year until it reaches zero, so that the people can be in charge of ourselves. One of the things that I've been pretty vocal about is reallocating those funds into a guaranteed basic income. Nashville, Tennessee is one of the cities in the continental U.S. that has committed to a guaranteed basic income. And what that is basically establishing a fund that benefits residents who are in a certain zip code or a certain neighborhood, and it supplements whatever their household income is in order to assist them with reaching a sustainable, way of life. That feels probably pretty radical to people, which is interesting because we just spent, what, $568 million to build that jail. IMPD's budget is going back up in October. They'll probably get another few million. They just allocated another $1 million to run surveillance in the hood. So like they're gonna put up those nice poles with the blue lights and read people's license plates, you know, and that's gonna target Black and brown people. But when you talk about reallocating those funds, all of a sudden people are like, well, you know, what about crime? And when we talk about crime, we're not actually talking about like those intercommunal, interpersonal harms that people experience. You're talking about the defense of property, and that's capitalism. Capitalism was established from chattel slavery. They brought my ancestors here, they boiled them alive, they bred them, they made them fight, they made them toil in the fields, they fed them scraps, they sold them. And that's how we're sitting in all of these nice gentrified areas in Indianapolis and beyond. That's why people have the salaries that they do. That's why we have endowment funds from universities and nonprofit organizations. It's through slavery. It's not because some white man, you know, decided, oh, I want to make, cotton. Okay. Yeah, but it is from chattel slavery. And I think it's important that we reframe our understanding of where the money came from so that we understand who deserves it. I think it's real, you know, I'm gonna just be frank because I'm really have a way not to be. It's cute that like people think that they earn their salary, but the salary is earned off of banks who got their wealth from slavery, you know? So I'm gonna come back to the point. For reallocating the funds, I'd like to see a guaranteed basic income to benefit not only the Far East Side, but also the MLK area, kind of like where Cleo's is. I'd like to see our children have access to grocery stores and community centers. I'd like for my people to be paid a living wage and not the employee living wage that says it's like, what, $13.67 an hour for a single person with no kids. Because that's not realistic in Indianapolis. I don't know if any of you make $14 an hour, but you probably don't live by yourself. And if you do, you probably work more than one job, you know? But that's something that like people say is a sustainable living wage in Indianapolis, which is not true. I'd like us to have more opportunities for rest and relaxation and joy so that we're not always put into a rapid response mindset. And in order for that to happen, it makes the most sense for us to look at the most punitive, harmful entity and say, we're actually going to commit to something besides allowing for the police to defend property and to kill Black and brown people while they're doing it.
Something that Jess said before was that you can go to all the DEI trainings, you can read the books and listen to the podcast, but if it is not resulting in systemic change, what are you doing? Like, I feel like unless you are pushing within your organizations, I know that people in this room work for organizations that have influence on the direction that this city is going, you need to push. So if you see something that is inequitable, you have to show up and speak up. Because if you don't, you're just being performative, and the systems that have been perpetuated over time will continue to stay in place. And one thing that I try to like push people to think or to consider when they're doing this work is that we are working towards building something that has never existed before. So it is going to take some courage and innovation to experiment and try new things that have never happened in order for us to get there. Like accepting that you can't prove that this hasn't worked is not good enough. You have to push the people who have power in the city within your organizations to make change.
I think just to add on to that, also like do your research, right? A lot of times people are eager to get into this work and just jump right into it and actually do more harm than good. So if you want to go and support, grassroots works, know who the leadership is. Honestly, 9 out of 10 times it's Black and brown folks. And make sure that you're respecting what they're saying, that respecting and listening to their leadership. Because a lot of the times our voices are pushed under the table or swept under the rug when we are the ones at the front of these protests. We are often not at the table. Yeah, definitely speak up if you are in any of the positions of power or in your spaces, but also let's try to create new tables, flip the table honestly, because if our people aren't there, if our people aren't present, then what type of system are we really living in? What type of system are you currently supporting? So make sure you do research, but also do it in a way that's sustainable.
You should be pushing for a community advisory council made up of community members that are the targeted demographic that your organization serves, and then equipping them with resources so that they can sit in the space that you're in. And it should be measurable, it should be attainable, it should be like within a time frame that makes sense. So don't just get like a community advisory council of like kids and youth and undocumented people and Black folks and poor people and just keep them on that level. Like, within 18 months, they should be eligible to sit on the board, meaning that you need to train them in development, how to write grants, make sure that they have a mentor, set them up with whatever academic experience they need in order to be able to step into those roles if they desire. And in the same vein, you need to be working on the equity within organizations, because something else that we talked about on a call that we were on was oftentimes people take model minorities and they place them within institutional harmful spaces with the hopes of diversifying it, or really you're just implementing institutional harm where it hadn't existed in that person's life before. So please don't bring a whole bunch of Black and poor and undocumented, brown and whatever people into your organization if you know that your workplace is hateful. Because bringing me in ain't gonna make me be like, oh, let me change some stuff around. Be like, I'm gonna rearrange the furniture in the room with you in it. Thank you. And policy-wise, definitely make sure that you're following Indiana Undocumented Youth Alliance. And then for any 10 Black Lives Matter, we need a food pantry, y'all. Amen, we need a food pantry. I'm gonna keep asking. We need a food pantry. The last 3 places that we've gone have turned us down because there was a fear that we would start protesting on their grounds. And I'm like, if you understood food apartheid, it's not food deserts, because food desert takes a passive voice. This is intentional, systemic separation of people from the resources. We want people to be fed. If people understood food apartheid, then they would join us with us to make sure that the pantry has a home